Mark Heim here, founder of Disaster Doc, speaking to you today about Module 12, Cold Weather. So let's go through those learning objectives together. After completing this lesson, the student will be able to define the term cold weather disaster, describe the risk factors for exposure and vulnerability during cold weather disasters, list the major causes of death in cold weather disasters, and also list the two major causes of death related to these same types of cold weather storms. We identify the major public health consequences of cold weather disasters in this particular objectives, and we'll also recognize the health impacts of cold weather disasters relative to other natural disasters. We'll recognize nations where cold weather disasters have been most frequent, and we'll also list two secondary disasters caused by cold weather disasters. We'll also recognize factors that increase the impact of cold weather disasters, and we'll identify measures that can lessen the health impact of these cold weather events. So first off, the definition, right? Disasters caused by severe winter conditions comprised of winter storms and extreme cold. That's the definition of cold weather disaster. These winter storms may include snow, they may include wind as well, they may also include ice. So there are two major causes of death associated with these cold weather disasters, hypothermia and asphyxia. So let's talk in more detail about those two aspects. Hypothermia is basically when the body temperature is too low. So it affects our heart and also affects our brain and our nervous system also. So hypothermia, yes, that's rather intuitive. But there's another cause that I want to talk to you about because it's also very important to recognize that actually asphyxia or suffocation is another cause of death when we're looking at cold weather disasters. Why is that? Well, it's because people use heating devices, whether it's charcoal or kerosene heaters or other things that are poorly ventilated. And actually these heating elements, whether they're sources from burning or actually improper combustion or incomplete combustion, give off carbon monoxide. And when it gives off carbon monoxide within an enclosed space, that carbon monoxide settles in that area and actually displaces oxygen. So you start breathing this in, this poisonous gas, instead of breathing in oxygen. And for that reason, many people succumb to this as being the second most common cause of death. So we have to recognize not only the cold, but it's the activities that people take to try to adapt or adjust. And we could say that that's sort of a maladjustment or a maladaptation. And we have to really train people and provide information and good, solid advice for folks to be able to make a difference and not fall into that trap of asphyxia when we're seeing this relation to carbon monoxide and cold weather. And in general, the public health consequences of cold weather disasters, we can see that, relatively few to moderate deaths with cold weather, but what's so remarkable is the large, extremely high number of injuries associated with cold weather. So a lot of frostbite injuries associated with these, and there are also some other type of traumatic injuries, but for the most part, directly associated with these carbon monoxide type of related deaths, hypothermia related deaths, are the injuries that our body sustains when it's exposed to cold. So we have frostbite injuries, we have these other types of injuries that are actually extremely high when we're talking about these cold weather disasters. Once again as well, public concern for safety is high once we start seeing the deaths occurring in these disasters. But in many areas of the world, especially areas where the winters are normally relatively severe, people kind of take for granted this cold weather and they don't realize just how dangerous these certain cold waves may be. And so therefore, I think there's a lot of public information, a lot of education that needs to be done to really share with people that these things are nothing to be trifled with. And certainly, especially as you will see, the large percentage of injuries that are associated with this kind of phenomenon, we really need to be more careful when we're talking about these cold waves. So let me share with you comparing these health impacts of cold weather compared to other natural disasters. So actually cold weather disasters have very low impact when we're talking about overall mortality rate. So that's a good news, right? The number of deaths per 100,000 people that are affected by cold weather disasters is actually very, very low. Only about 21 people out of 100,000 would be expected to die if we're looking at the past history of the past 50 years, for example. The same thing as well, it's a very low death-to-injury ratio. Many more injuries than there are deaths in these cold-related natural disasters. However, number one highest injury rate of all natural disasters over the past 50 years, cold weather. Does that surprise you? Number one, above earthquakes, above tsunamis, highest injury rate per 100,000 people. That's pretty remarkable, and so that's where I think we can really improve upon this. We're not taking this cold weather disaster thing seriously enough, and we really have a lot to do to be able to lower that number. So I want you to join me, share that information with people that you think may be at risk so that we can lower that number together. Let's look at the world's 10 deadliest cold weather disasters over the past 50 years, and this actually may be a little counterintuitive for you as well. Now we can see that the number one is actually Afghanistan. Relatively low numbers of deaths though, only 1,317 deaths in that particular disaster. Now, I don't want to minimize the amount of deaths and these deaths that occur among these people being 1,300. 1,300 deaths to me is still too much. But of course, when we compare that to some of the numbers we looked at for tropical cyclones, where there were 300,000 deaths in one event, or for example, landslides, 30,000 deaths in one day. So it's obviously, in comparison to that, this is much lower as far as fatality rates. But the thing that I find most interesting about this particular table is the number of cold weather disasters that occurred in India. You can see in this particular table, India is in there 5 times. Bangladesh actually in there as well. Things that we would normally not assume, if we're not living in India. I'm sure the Indians recognize this and appreciate this much better than I do from across the world. But I was kind of surprised to find out that this is actually not just those areas where I would think of extreme weather in the sense of cold weather, but it's actually areas that we would normally assume, being as outsiders, that we'd think that this wouldn't necessarily occur. So we learn a little bit more when we look at the numbers for each one of these types of disasters. There are a couple of main secondary disasters or exacerbations of that primary disaster that really cause things to worsen as well when we're looking at health outcomes. And one of them, just like in the heat waves, cold waves are associated with power outages for several different reasons. Number one is that the ice that accumulates on many of the wires, people tend to string wires for power up in the telephone poles and so on. When trees get weighted down with ice, they fall on those wires, they break those wires, and we have these large power outages. Just when you need the heating, the electricity, and the other public utilities that we need to heat our homes even more, that's when we lose the power in many of these major urban areas, and actually in large areas throughout an entire region may be affected as well. So these secondary power outages then worsen the problem once again. People lose access to medications, they may lose access to being able to heating, cooling, and so on. Their refrigerators no longer work and so on. So there's a lot of climate control issues and being able to regulate the temperature to the appropriate measures that we lose when we have these cold weather disasters. In addition, also, there's a stress on the healthcare system because there may be more of these injuries of people going to the hospital, going to clinics, and increased demand, but yet decreased resources. Human resources may be decreased because people just can't get to work. The doctors, the nurses, the lab techs, the other people that are so important in being able to run our healthcare system on a daily basis may not be able to transport to work. They may not be able to get back and forth as they need to, and therefore we have decreased resource options when we're looking at stress on this healthcare system as a secondary problem during these cold weather disasters. And there are measures, though, that we can reduce the health impact of cold weather disasters. In particular, we can reduce them in the short term, and we can also reduce them in the long term as well. And you've heard me say this many times. We have to think in terms of long-term issues when we're looking at the real ability to reduce the risk of disasters worldwide. One of them in short term is the issue of cold weather hazard mapping. So we can identify those areas of the country and various parts of the world that are going to have issues with cold weather. Well, of course, we know those traditionally, and it doesn't take much scientific investigation to be able to go back to the historical records and see where those extremes of temperature are. And then being able to monitor that weather and then forecasting it. And then when cold weather does occur as well, being able to provide early warning to those populations that may be more severely affected, and being able to communicate that risk to them, being able to communicate the protective actions that are necessary, some of the threats that they may not necessarily be thinking of, for example, like carbon monoxide, or the large number of injuries, or the large number of cardiovascular illnesses that occur, for example, like with heart attacks that occur when people are shoveling snow, or the types of injuries that occur when people are falling on ice or being injured by traffic-related accidents that are exacerbated by snow and ice. In addition as well, what we really need to think about in reducing short-term exposure are safe evacuations and safe sheltering for people who've lost their heat. They have no ability to heat their homes, and therefore now they need a safe shelter option. They need to be plugged into the community through outreach potential so that they can actually be helped and assisted in a way in the short term so that they can actually get to the warm area. Now, these cold waves don't last forever, of course, and so therefore we can actually do these community outreaches, get people into warm areas, and then get them back home as soon as possible so that there's least disruption in their lives. But it takes some forethought, it takes foreplanning. And then in addition as well, this long-term exposure issue I want to talk to you about because, building codes and mitigating weather-related power failures are very important. So the way we choose to run power to the homes, the way we provide this power in areas of temperate climates where there is the possibility to lose your heat, we have to think in terms of ways we can sustain that over time. Now, that's not something we can solve this season or solve today just in 1 or 2 days or even a few months. We need to think of long-term options of being able to provide power in a way that's sustainable over time so that people can depend upon it and we have less of the disruptions. And of course, that's not only as far as humanitarian options, but economic as well. Loss of power means loss of income, loss of profits, loss of revenues, and so on. So all of this works together in being able to have a sustainable power choice. And then finally, as well, with these long-term exposure options, developing better studies and better understanding of the occupational health and safety challenges that come with working in the cold over long periods of time. Now, certainly, cold protection and personal protective equipment related to cold much improved over a period of time. We also have to recognize that there are other threats that go on that occur when we're talking about people that work in the cold, not only related to the cold itself, but obviously if power is out and we have people that are going out in these areas and trying to restring power, we have put them in harm's way as well. So a long-term solution for these things, to think in terms of this. Science is continuing to work in that direction, but we can do more and we can do better. We also want to reduce the vulnerability to cold weather disasters. And once again, healthy people just survive disasters better. They do the same thing with cold weather disasters as well. Health promotion, lessening the health disparity when people have more economic options for heating their home rather than the cheapest possible thing of charcoal or something that may be a cheap option as well. Lessening the dependence upon daily care, where you're dependent upon someone to come to your home or you have to go for medical care on a daily basis. That makes you more dependent upon the transportation system and the ability to get in and out of your home. That can be changed significantly when we're talking about cold weather disasters, where people may have a lot of difficulty getting up and down the highways with ice and snow and those kinds of things as well. In addition, improving the personal mobility of people, a long-term goal that just makes things better for everyone, and community communication, public knowledge, and awareness of the danger of these particular disasters. I think all of this builds together to lower our susceptibility and lower our vulnerability to cold weather disasters, period. We can build capacity once again to be resilient against cold weather disasters just the same as we can do so with other disasters as well. Healthy people with access to resources are more resilient against these disasters. So people that have access to economic resources, to educational resources, to healthcare, to emergency services, to transportation, for example, that could be used for evacuation and putting them into a safe shelter. All of these resources build capacity for communities, for individuals, for societies to be able to be more resilient against cold weather. So this is a very inclusive picture that we're talking about here. All of these things, as I say, are no regret options. We can really be a better society without the disasters if we do all of these things. But in times of disaster, once again, these elements make people healthier and therefore more resilient. And measures that lessen the health impact of disasters also involve building this capacity for healthy buildings. So structural and non-structural mitigation for power loss, maintaining the power and the heating capability, or alternative heating sources that are actually not dangerous, improving the capacity for cold weather sheltering, the ability to ramp up cold weather sheltering options for people that are safe and effective and easy to access and so on and equitable for everyone. Those are all keenly important when we're talking about healthy buildings. In addition, healthy communities. Once again, resilient public services and infrastructure. It's really the key here when we're talking about any of these disasters. And also, public services in particular that include a surge capacity for snow removal and also for power line repair in getting these power failures back online. You know, I'm from Atlanta, and that's where I live, and that's where my business is now. And you can, many of you may have heard of the story of Atlanta, where we had 1.5 inches of snow and no ability to be able to move around in the particular city. You know, the city was nearly paralyzed by less than 2 inches of snow. Well, once again, Atlanta doesn't get much snow. We had no surge capacity for snow removal, for ice removal, and really a little bit of snow just paralyzed us. So the ability to have this surge capacity for snow removal, even in areas where there may not normally be very much snow, or in areas that do get snow but then end up getting a lot of it, or a lot of ice storms like those that happen in northern China or northern United States as well, or in these other countries that we learned about, India and Afghanistan and so on. The ability to have this surge capacity is very important, although we have to think about that in terms of long advanced planning as opposed to something that we can be ready for tomorrow.